When I received the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't shocked. He had always been the charming, reckless type, someone who could easily find trouble and wasn't too bothered by it. But this time felt different. This wasn't just a short stint. He was looking at 10 years in prison for having over a pound of cocaine on him. They said it was hidden in the trunk of his car, packed away like groceries. It stung. He had promised us that he was clean, that his wild days were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd make a point of reminding us that he was staying on the straight and narrow. We had our doubts. Old habits don't just disappear after all. But a pound? None of us saw that coming. My uncle swore up and down that the drugs weren't his, claiming he'd been set up, that someone was out to get him. But whenever we pressed him, he'd shut down, muttering that a decade in prison was better than whatever they would do to him. After the sentencing, my mom called, her voice tight, asking if I could go to his place and sort through his things. It was the kind of thing you do for family, something I couldn't refuse. We weren't close, but family is family, and it feels like you have to step up, even when you know it's a bad idea. So, with my uncle locked up for the next 10 years, I took it upon myself to clear out his apartment and store his things. I didn't know why I felt so eager, but maybe it was because I thought it was the least I could do. The place was a mess, exactly as I'd expected. His kitchen was full of thrift store pots and pans, all of them scratched and mismatched. I could imagine him cooking at the stove, a cigarette hanging from his lips, stirring whatever random meal he was making with those battered pans. The living room was its own kind of graveyard. Ashtrays filled nearly every surface, packed with weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls had a sickly yellow tint from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same color, covered in the grime of a nasty habit that had seeped into every corner of the place. It was clear he hadn't opened a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost hoping the yellow residue would come off. Didn't. In one corner of the room stood his prized collection. Star Trek figurines and posters, all haphazardly lined up on a crooked shelf he'd probably nailed together himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always talking about episodes I'd never seen and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, determined stares seemed to watch me as I packed up his treasures, ready to be tucked away in boxes for who knows how long. It took a few days, but I finally got most of the place packed up. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates to a storage unit across town, until the apartment was nearly empty. All that was left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-soaked walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging in the windows. There was no way he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically embedded in the place. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen, my hand brushed something hidden in the shadows of a cabinet. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather soft from age, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with stains and smudges, showing years of use. The entries were scattered, written down randomly, almost as if whoever had kept this book wrote down recipes as they came to mind, with no concern for order. As I flipped through the pages, a strange feeling crept over me. It felt like this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who brought the family together each year with his homemade meals. Every holiday was anchored by the dishes he cooked, recipes no one had ever been able to replicate. This book might hold the secrets to those dishes, a piece of him that somehow ended up with my uncle after my grandfather passed. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense of dread as I held it. The leather felt cold, almost damp, and as I turned the pages, a chill ran through me. Felt wrong, like there was more to this book than just family recipes. Curious, I brought it to my mom. She took one look at the handwriting on the yellowed pages and nodded. her face softening with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said, almost reverently, running her fingers over the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a look of surprise crossed her face. She had been searching for it for years and never knew her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, nostalgia mixed with something else, maybe sadness or reverence. I could tell the book meant a lot to her, which made me even more determined to preserve it. "Can I hold onto it a little longer?" I asked. "I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself so we don't lose any of his recipes." My mom agreed without hesitation, relieved that I was taking the time to preserve something she hadn't realized was still around. So I got to work. Over the next few weeks, whenever I had a spare moment, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't focused on the recipes themselves, more concerned with ensuring that each page was legible. I didn't pay much attention to the strange ingredients and odd notes scattered throughout. My goal was just to make the text accessible, ensuring that the digital version would last forever. Once I finished, I spent a few hours piecing the scanned pages together to create a smooth digital copy. When it was done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a strange sense of relief and satisfaction. The recipes were now safe, and I thought that was the end of it. But the unease I'd felt in the kitchen, holding that old leather book, stuck with me longer than I expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the book. Scanning it had been a small task, one I'd planned to follow up on by cooking a few of my grandfather's dishes. But like so many things, life got in the way, and the book's contents faded from my mind. Then Thanksgiving came around. I headed over to my parents' house, expecting the usual turkey, stuffing, and the familiar spread we always had. But when I walked in, something felt off right away. A large bird sat in the center of the table, roasted to perfection, but it didn't look quite right. It was smaller than a turkey, and its skin looked darker, rougher than the golden brown I was used to. "Nice chicken," I said, assuming they changed things up this year. My mom just shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said quietly. "It's a hen." I looked at her, confused. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to casually explain. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unfocused, like she was lost in thought. For a moment, she seemed distant, almost blank, as though she didn't know how to answer. Then, suddenly, she blinked, her gaze snapping back to me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, her voice oddly sharp. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just stressed from cooking. But when I looked at the bird again, a flicker of unease crept in, a feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside while my mom finished cleaning up. "What's going on with Mom tonight?" I asked in a low voice. He just shrugged it off, waving it away with a smile. "You know how she is," he said, as if her strange behavior was just another one of her quirks. He didn't give it another thought, moving on to something else. But I couldn't shake the odd feeling. The whole meal had been off. The hen was coated in a sweet-smelling sauce with a faint walnut-like taste, almost covering its pale, ashen hue. It lay on a bed of unfamiliar greens, probably some garnish, along with neatly sliced parsnips and radishes, arranged as though they were meant to look perfect. It was all too elaborate for my mom's usual Thanksgiving style. When she sat down, she led us in saying grace, her voice soft, almost reverent. As she began cutting into the hen, an odd excitement lit up her face, one I'd never seen before. She served it up, watching us closely as we took our first bites. I wasn't sure what I expected, but when I tasted it, I knew immediately that this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving fare. The meat was tough, stringy even, and didn't pull apart easily, far from the tender turkey or chicken we usually had. Mom kept glancing between my dad and me, her face full of eager anticipation, like she was waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling. Her wide eyes as if she were expecting us to uncover some hidden secret. When I finally asked, "What's got you so excited, Mom?" she just smiled, her expression softening. "Oh, it's just that cookbook you found among Grandpa's things. It's like having a piece of him here with every dish I make." She spoke with a reverence I hadn't heard in her voice for years, as if she was talking about something far deeper than just food. I nodded, trying to go along with it. "It's good," I said, hoping she'd relax. "I liked it, but honestly, I wished we'd had a more traditional Thanksgiving meal. The food wasn't bad, but something about it felt off. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, and maybe deep down I didn't want to. Once we finished, I said my goodbyes and left, trying to shake the lingering discomfort. My mom's face, her excitement, replayed in my mind. And then there was the hen. Why a hen? Why the pale ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic in the way she'd prepared it, a precision I'd never seen from her before. The night dragged on, and the questions gnawed at me, growing in my mind, refusing to let me rest. When I got home, the weird feeling from dinner still lingered. I sat down at my desk, finally opening the scanned file I had saved on my desktop months ago. The folder had sat untouched, and now, seeing it open, I understood why I had procrastinated. The handwriting was dense, almost like calligraphy, each letter flowing into the next. The words seemed to dance across the pages in an eerie, whimsical way. I had to squint, leaning closer to make sense of the script. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill crept down my spine. The names were unsettling, more like old spells than recipes. Mother's Last Supper porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, elder's ember bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I felt a heaviness in the room, as if the words themselves carried a strange, eerie energy. Then, I found it, the recipe for the dish my mom had made tonight, Ancestors' Offering. The title was written in the same flowing calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read it. The dish was described as a maple-braised hen with black walnut and root puree, but it didn't sound like any recipe I had ever encountered. The instructions were worded oddly, almost as if they were written centuries ago. Each ingredient was listed with a sense of purpose, as though it held a hidden power. My eyes skimmed down to the meat. It specifically called for a hen, not just any chicken. The body must be that of a mother, it said. A shiver ran through me, remembering the strange way my mom had insisted it was a hen and not a chicken, correcting me when I had made the mistake. The instructions continued, noting that the hen should be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, a type of honeysuckle, according to a quick search online. As I read on, a chill seeped deeper into my bones. The recipe stated it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I recalled dinner and how we had sat down exactly as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. But the final instruction was the most unsettling, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in revulsion. The recipe called for something called ancestors' salt. The note at the bottom explained that this salt was actually a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I leaned back, cold sweat breaking out across my skin as I remembered the pale, ashen sauce that coated the hen, the faint, sweet scent it gave off. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. Had my mom really used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just some old folklore nonsense. But the image of her smiling face as she served us that meal, the gleam in her eyes, kept creeping back into my mind. I felt my stomach twist, while rising in my throat as the horrifying thought sank deeper. A few days later, the gnawing unease became too much to ignore. I kept telling myself I was probably just overreacting, that the odd details in the recipe were nothing more than a strange family tradition I didn't quite understand. But the dread that surfaced every time I remembered that meal wouldn't leave me. So I decided to call my mom. I planned the conversation carefully, wanting to come across as casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, her gardening, anything to warm her up a little. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even telling her it was the best we'd had in years. When I finally mentioned the recipe book, her voice immediately brightened. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, sounding genuinely happy. "I had no idea he'd written down so many wonderful recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was special, but to have all these dishes documented, it's been such a joy." I chuckled, trying to keep the tone light. "I actually looked up that dish you made, Ancestors' Offering. I thought I might try it myself sometime." "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding interested. "Yeah, though I thought it was a little strange that the recipe specifically calls for a hen, not just a regular chicken, since they're so much tougher. And the part that says it has to be the body of a mother." I let the words hang, hoping she'd offer some explanation to make it sound less sinister. For a moment, there was only silence on her end. Then, quietly, she said, "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." Her voice was different now, lower, as if she were carefully choosing her words. My heart began pounding, and I decided to press a little further. "I also noticed it calls for something called Ancestor's Salt," I said, pretending to be confused, masking the fact that I had already read the footnote explaining it. "What's that supposed to be?" The silence stretched even longer, until it felt like a ringing hum in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to go," she murmured, sounding dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, and the phone went dead, leaving me in stunned silence. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. My stomach twisted as I stared at the blank screen. I couldn't tell if I was more afraid of what I might find out or what I might already know. I hesitated, but eventually called my dad, needing to check in. When he picked up, I told him about my conversation with Mom and how strange she'd been acting. "She went into her garden right after you two spoke," he said, sounding unconcerned. "Started tending to her plants and hasn't said a word since." I tried nudging him a bit, asking if he could maybe get her to talk to me, but he brushed it off. "You're overreacting. You know how your mother gets sentimental about family stuff. She'll be fine. Don't keep pressing her. It'll just upset her. Give her some space." I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. "Yeah, all right, you're probably right." After we hung up, I decided to let it go and went about my day, chalking it up to my mom's usual habit of getting overly attached to sentimental things. She'd always treated family heirlooms like they were sacred, almost magical. But this time, that nagging feeling refused to let go. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. Sitting back down at my computer, I opened the digital copy of the cookbook and scrolled aimlessly through the pages. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. I let the file skip to a random section, thinking I'd try making something small, something harmless. But as I scrolled, my eyes landed on the very last page, which held a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread. The instructions were sparse, but each word felt heavy, filled with purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long. A chill ran down my spine. I shook my head, a mix of amusement and unease washing over me. It was all nonsense, I told myself. Probably just some old superstitions my grandfather had picked up over the years. But still, something about it made my heart beat just a little faster. Ignoring the growing chill that ran down my spine, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. I'd humor it, I thought. After all, it was just bread. I scanned the ingredients for Elder's Ember bread, feeling time slip away as if I were being drawn into some strange trance. My mind blurred, the steps of the process fading into a fog, yet I couldn't stop moving. I gathered everything without thinking too much about it, each action pulling me deeper, as though I was walking down some ancient, well-worn path. I caught fleeting flashes, the sweet scent of elderberry and honey, the heavy weight of raw rye, the sharp, pungent smell of wood burnt to charcoal. At one point, I found myself murmuring something under my breath, words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't consciously meant to speak. The air was thick with the scent of warmed goat's milk, blending with creamy butter that had darkened over low heat. A faint trace of yew ash wafted through the room, curling into my nostrils like smoke from a hidden fire. By the time I snapped out of it, night had fallen, and the kitchen was dark and still. There, sitting on the counter, was the bread. A dark, dense loaf, its crust blackened but glistening with an almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich and moist, and as I stared at it, a strange sense of pride swelled within me. Unnatural and unsettling, like a voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, insisting I'd done well. Without thinking much, I sliced a piece and carried it to the living room, feeling compelled to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky yet tinged with a subtle berry sweetness. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted, but oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth spread deep in my chest, radiating through me like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as if the bread were warming me from the inside out. Before I knew it, I had finished the entire slice. Not because I particularly enjoyed it, but because some strange sense of obligation had driven me to finish every bite. When I set the plate down, the warmth lingered. A heavy presence settled deep inside me, and in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint, rhythmic beat. A heartbeat, steady and ancient, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the Elder's Ember bread more often than I intended. I'd find myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing a thick piece from the loaf without even realizing I'd gotten up to do it. It felt instinctive, almost as if some quiet impulse was guiding me back to it on those late, silent nights. Each time I took a bite, that same deep warmth would swell inside me, radiating outward like embers glowing from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mother had made, a meal that had left me with an uncomfortable sense of unease, the ember bread felt different. It was as though each bite carried something I couldn't quite place, something familiar and almost affectionate, like a labor of love embedded in every grain. The days blended together, but the questions didn't fade. I tried reaching out to my mom several times, hoping she might open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange meals. But every time I brought it up, she'd deflect, changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. She hadn't invited me over for dinner since Thanksgiving, and the distance between us felt like a slow, widening gulf. Even my dad, when I asked about her, shrugged it off, saying she was just going through a phase. But the coldness in her responses, her constant avoidance of the book, only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept returning to the ember bread, feeling its subtle pull every time the sun set, as though I were being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it felt less like a meal and more like communion. A quiet bond that seemed to grow stronger with every piece I consumed. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle in prison. I was able to leave a message, so I kept it short. Just told him it was his nephew, wished him well, and let him know I'd send him $100 for commissary. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy over the line but grateful. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a short laugh. "You know how it is in here. Money makes things easier." We chatted for a bit, catching up. He'd been in and out of prison so often that I'd come to accept it as part of his life. Now in his 60s, he spoke about his time behind bars with a kind of resignation, almost relief. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said, almost amused. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a breath and brought up the reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was cleaning out your place, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then added quickly, "I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate. The warm, casual tone in his voice shifted instantly, becoming cold and sharp. "Listen to me," he said, each word deliberate and heavy. "If you have that book, you need to throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low, almost trembling. "That book, it brings out terrible things in people." He paused, as if weighing how much to say. "My father, your grandfather, he was into some dark stuff you don't just find in the back of an old family recipe. And that book," he drew in a breath, "that book wasn't his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother. She passed it down to him before he even knew what it was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt everything fall into place. "They were used to survive hard times," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've heard about what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate they got. But this," he exhaled sharply, "those recipes are ancient, passed down through whispers, not paper. But they're not for everyday meals. They're for invoking things, bringing things out. The kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful." My hand tightened around the phone as a cold shiver crawled down my spine, my mind racing back to the ember bread, the warmth it had left in my chest, the strange satisfaction that hadn't felt entirely my own. "Promise me," he urged, his voice almost pleading. "Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book for anything casual. Those recipes can keep a person alive in hard times. Sure, but they weren't meant to be used. Not unless you're ready to live with the consequences." A cold chill settled over me as I realized how deep this had all gone. I hesitated, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I described the elder's ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, the warmth it filled me with, but left out the part about how I'd almost felt compelled to eat it. He let out a harsh sigh and scolded me, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "You shouldn't have touched that bread. None of it. Do you understand me?" I felt a pang of guilt. "I know. I'm sorry. I promise. I won't make anything else from the book." "Good," he said, his voice calming a little. "But that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she does something she can't undo." I tried to assure him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his tone dead serious. "You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't." Over the next few weeks, as Christmas approached, I stayed in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep the conversations going. Each time we talked, the discussion would circle back to the book. I'd tell him about my progress or lack of it, how I'd tried visiting my mom, only for her to brush me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time. And every time I talked to her, she seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if that recipe book were casting a shadow over her. One day, I decided to drop by without warning. When I showed up on her doorstep, she didn't seem pleased to see me. "You should have called first," she said, forcing a smile. "It's rude, just showing up like this." Her tone was tight, her words clipped. I tried to play it off, shrugging and saying I just missed her and wanted to check in. But as I scanned the house, a creeping unease settled over me. I searched for any sign of the book, hoping I could find it and take it with me, but it was nowhere to be seen. Each time I left, empty-handed, I felt like I was being watched from the shadows, like something unseen was observing me as I walked out the door. Every call with my uncle became more urgent, his insistence that I retrieve the book growing more desperate. "You have to try harder," he'd say, his voice strained. "If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen. You have to believe me." And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse lurking in that book. But it was more than that. Something in my mom's voice, her distant gaze, even her scolding felt off. Every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, as though I was getting closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Christmas Day finally arrived, and despite my mother's recent evasions, there was no avoiding me this time. I gathered up the presents I'd bought for them, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping the tension between us would somehow ease in the warmth of the holiday. When I knocked, she opened the door and gave a quick, half-hearted hug. The scent of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a moment, I thought maybe she'd set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I relaxed a little, hoping the day would be less tense than I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's fussing over. You know him?" She gestured toward the dining room, where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I took off my coat, glancing back at her. She was already turned away, busying herself with the last touches on the table, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and I could sense the familiar warmth in her was missing. It was like she was there, but somehow absent. Not wanting to upset my mother on Christmas, I placed my gifts with the others under the tree and took my seat at the dining table. The plate in front of me was polished and waiting, a silver fork and knife perfectly aligned on either side, but the emptiness of it left an unsettling pit in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing back toward the hallway leading to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. His silence was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mother replied from the kitchen. "He had a big breakfast, so he'll join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about her response didn't sit right. It wasn't like my dad to skip a Christmas meal, not for any reason. A small, insistent thought tugged at me. Maybe it was the book again, casting shadows over everything in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from the table. Before I could even take a step, she entered the dining room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost blackened, the glaze thick and rich, coating every crisscrossed cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her voice oddly stern, a hint of irritation slipping through her usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped, glancing from her to the closed door of the garage. The words "special meal" repeated in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad. That's all. I haven't even said hello." Her face tensed, her grip tightening around the platter as her voice rose. "Sit down and enjoy lunch with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was supposed to follow without question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lying just beneath the surface of her insistence. "No," I snapped, my voice echoing through the dining room. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked at her, my words thick in the silence, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face contorted, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." I took a step toward the garage, determined to get my dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. That book had wormed its way too deep into her mind. She shrieked and threw herself in front of the door, arms outstretched as if to block my path. Her face was flushed, her voice frantic. "Don't go in there. Please just sit down. Enjoy the meal, savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically pleading. There was a desperation in her voice that sounded like fear, not just of me but of what lay beyond that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her body a thin, shaky barrier. "Please," she whispered, voice thin and desperate. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him. Dad," I called out, raising my voice over her pleas. Silence answered at first, followed by a muffled sound. A low, guttural moan, thick and unnatural, rising from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood turning cold as the sound slipped into a horrible, wet gurgle. My mother's face went white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I'd heard him. I felt a surge of adrenaline take over, and before she could react, I shoved her aside and yanked open the door. The sight that met me would be seared into my memory forever. I stepped into the garage and froze, my stomach lurching at the scene before me. My dad lay sprawled across his workbench, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tied tightly with a belt just above the thigh, a makeshift tourniquet attempting to staunch the flow of blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh where his leg had been crudely severed, and blood pooled on the concrete floor beneath him, glistening in the cold fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, trying to form words, a barely audible rasp escaping as he struggled to speak. "Help me." I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it was hard to hit the right buttons. My mother's shrill screams erupted from behind me as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading. "Stop, please, just sit down, just have lunch with me," she wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Her face was twisted in desperation, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen, couldn't. I backed up, keeping a wide berth between her and my dad, and relayed the horror I was seeing to the dispatcher. "It's my dad, he's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, voice cracking. Please, you need to hurry. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, asking me to stay on the line, but my mother's desperate cries filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched at her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she repeated, "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding, as I watched her spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. She only circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the house, and rushed into the garage to assess the situation. My mother resisted, screaming and flailing as they restrained her, her pleas becoming incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back and join her at the table. Paramedics rushed in and began working on my dad, quickly stabilizing him and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, barely able to process the scene that had unfolded. In the frigid December air, my mind reeled, looping over her chilling words and the horrible sight in that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and familiarity had turned into something I could barely comprehend, twisted into a nightmare I would never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes. But as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion. The book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone, staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop. The digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I fear that it may have a hold on me,